Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer, and you can see from our exciting background that we are going to be spending some time commemorating the American Revolution. And in purchasing this backdrop for our show, the creator thinks that the founding father to my right, your left, is George Washington. Well, clearly, we need better history education because we know that is Ben Franklin. Our topic, the first of three, is going to be picturing the American Revolution. And as you can see from our first slide here, the Bureau of Printing and Engraving is getting ready for this in the first of a series of wonderful commemorative stamps, this one called Battlefields of the American Revolution. I have bought several sheets of these stamps, and the only problem is I hate to put them on envelopes, but that's the whole purpose of stamps. But in thinking about pictures of the American Revolution, I asked several of my learned friends, when you think about the American Revolution, and if you have a visual image, what is the first one that comes to mind? And 4 out of friends surveyed said Washington crossing the Delaware. So here is this monumental painting that has had pride of place in the Metropolitan Museum of Art for over a century. It's a magnificent historical picture, larger than life. I've taken students to see it many times. It was painted by a German artist, Emanuel Leutze, who completed his first version in 1849 as a political statement because the German states, he was from Bavaria, had had a series of uprisings, and he wanted to create an inspiring political picture. The version that we're seeing here dates from 1851. And since we are so familiar with it, it's worth a closer look at what's going on here. George Washington's boat is crowded with 13 men. Their dress tells us that they are soldiers from different parts of America, and each has a story. One man wears the short tarpaulin jacket of a New England seaman, and if we look again, we see that he is of African descent. Another is a recent Scottish immigrant still wearing his Balmoral bonnet. A third is an androgynous figure in a loose red shirt, maybe a woman in man's clothing pulling at an oar. At the bow and the stern of the boat are hard-faced Western riflemen in hunting shirts and deerskin leggings. Huddled in the back of the boat are farmers from Pennsylvania and New Jersey in blanket coats and broad-brimmed hats. One carries a countryman's double-barreled shotgun. So as you can see here from these various people that are on the boat, this is a real slice of different people representing each one of the colonies. The tallest figure in the boat, of course, is George Washington. If this were a photograph, we would know how he was standing would have toppled the boat. And the person, another Virginian, who is the flag bearer, is none other than James Monroe, who would go on to be the 5th President of the United States. This image, so familiar to us, was painted 75 years after the fact. So in our exploration today, we are going to look at contemporary images leading up and through the American Revolution. These would consist of prints, of cartoons, and broadsides. And a good place to start this contemporary visual record of leading up to the American Revolution is this image from the time of the 7 years or the French and Indian War that was published in Ben Franklin's newspaper, Join or Die. And we can see here that this was a message that the colonies had better join together for survival rather than be cut up into separate parts. It's worthwhile for us to always remember that the real beginning of the American Revolution lies in the conclusion of the French and Indian, or the 7 Years' War, when the British government was saddled with an enormous amount of debt and then sought to more strictly enforce taxes among the colonists, which of course were very unpopular. Paul Revere did much more than his famous ride in 1775. He was an important pamphleteer and patriot leading up to the Revolution. And in 1766, he created 4 obelisks with various patriotic inscriptions on them to celebrate the repeal of the Stamp Act. And the only evidence that we have of these 4 obelisks that were erected in the Boston Common is this print that Paul Revere made in the year 1766. We get into one of the truly iconic images at the start of the American Revolution, and that is of the Boston Massacre. And the first image is one that was created by Henry Pelham. And Henry Pelham was the half-brother of John Singleton Copley. And again, one of the things that we just need to consider here, there were no art museums as we know them today. So the paintings that are so familiar to us, like Leutz's Washington crossing the Delaware, people wouldn't have seen that at the time. But in these images that we're looking at here, that are part of the startup of the American Revolution, these would be widely disseminated through the colonies. And the other thing, by having the juxtaposition of these 2 images here, is that very often people stole from one another. And the first image was made by Henry Pelham, and then Paul Revere simply lifted it and gave us a more sharply delineated image, which was a mezzotint process by which he engraved in a plate and used little dots to give the differentiation of color. And what we can't see clearly here, but I'm going to read to you, is that Paul Revere actually composed a verse to go with this highly propagandized image of the British soldiers shooting at a crowd. Unhappy Boston, see thy sons deplore, thy hallowed walks besmeared with guiltless gore, while faithless Preston and his savage bands with murderous rancor stretch their bloody hands. Like fierce barbarians grinning o'er their prey, approve the carnage and enjoy the day. If scalding drops from rage, from anguish wrong, if speechless sorrows laboring for a tongue, or if a weeping world can aught appease, the plaintive ghosts of victims such as these, the patriots' copious tears for each are shed, a glorious tribute which embalms the dead. But no fate summons to that awful goal, where justice strips the murderer of his soul. Should venal counts, the scandal of the land, snatch the relentless villain from her band, keen execrations of this plate inscribed shall reach a judge who can never be bribed. What a vocabulary. And there was yet one more person taking Paul Revere's image and doing his version of it. Paul Revere also did this view of Boston in 1766. He made it a little bit after the fact. And the purpose of this image, you can see in the scroll at the top, a view of part of the town of Boston in New England and British ships of war landing their troops. This type of image was to alert the colonists to the imminent threat that England was closing in on them. Another image, once again, of the same, and this would be published in a magazine at the time that was called the Royal American Magazine. An image here rather disturbing is after the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. So here the caption at the bottom says, "The able doctor or America swallowing the bitter draft." So here we have America unclad as an Indian maiden, and America is being force-fed the tea, while we see foppish British gentlemen looking on. So again, an image that was propagandized and meant to really get a reaction, which we certainly do even 250 years later after seeing this particular image. At left, we see the Bostonians paying the excise man. And this is a reminder that people who were complicit with the British in enforcing the taxes, the tea tax, the Stamp Act tax, would pay a very, very heavy price. So we see the man here, who was the excise man, was tarred and feathered, which certainly was a torturous thing to endure, to be having hot tar poured all over your skin and rolled in feathers. And we have the threat of this man being hanged from the Liberty Tree. In the same mezzotint engraver did another image in which he pictures the people of Boston imprisoned, hanging on a Liberty Tree, and they're being poked and prodded by the British. We have so many images coming out of Boston, not only because of the printing presses that were available in Boston, but we've often said that Boston truly was the cradle of revolution. At left, we have a new method of macaroni making. Now, what is macaroni? If we think of Yankee Doodle and called it macaroni, a macaroni was a term for a dandy. And once again here, we have someone who is probably a loyalist or working with the British, and he is rolled in tar and feathers. And to give us a glimpse of the violence that we sometimes forget that was part of the American Revolution, really almost reminiscent of a civil war, is that the Loyalists or the Tories were often dealt with violently. So we have in this image a Tory who was being suspended from a liberty pole. The next two images are the first contemporary images of an American battle. So here we have a color image from 1775 by Amos Doolittle of the Battle of Lexington, where we can see here the carnage of people dying. In the immediate foreground of the painting, we can see the amassed British regulars. And in the second image here, in the aftermath of the Battle of Concord, we can see British regiments, and again drawing our attention to the cost of this battle with the soldiers that are in the cemetery. So images like these are rare survivors, and they are among the few images that we have of Revolutionary War battles being recorded almost after the fact. A cartoon here called "Poor Old England Endeavoring to Reclaim His Wicked American Children." So here we have a rather stern Ichabod Crane-ish caricature of an Englishman trying to yoke in and restrain the American colonists. And we actually have here one of the American colonists mooning the British man. So if we think that everything was kind of neat and tidy in cartoons at the time, think again, this is a pretty ribald cartoon. Look at this one called the female combatant. So here we have Britain looking more like a Marie Antoinette saying, "I will force you to obedience, you rebellious slut." And then in this bizarre depiction of America as an Indian maiden with feathers and topless, the maiden says, "Liberty, liberty forever, mother, while I exist." The motto of the state of Virginia was forged in 1776 as the Revolution started. So here, once again, we have the Liberty figure, a little bit more clad here, and it says, "Sic semper tyrannus," thus always to tyrants. So we have liberty vanquishing tyranny here. And if you remember, when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater, as he leapt from the balcony, he tried to say this, but it didn't come out exactly correctly. So years later, when John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln, he thought he was killing a tyrant. The best known man in America, the face even during the American Revolution itself, would be George Washington. So we have here one of the first widely disseminated prints of George Washington. Notice that he is already called His Excellency. And it's a curious thing that we see these poses of George Washington with his left hand in his vest. And there have been many speculative explanations to this, particularly when it comes to Napoleon. It seems that many of Napoleon's images would be with his right hand inserted in his vest. And did he have an ulcer? No, he didn't have an ulcer. It was one of those things, it was just a stylized pose at the time. When we look sometimes back at high school yearbooks and we see students sometimes with their hands folded and a chin resting on their hands, or if we see someone with a hand covering the face, it was just a stylized pose at the time. And on the right-hand image, we have an engraving by Charles Willson Peale of a portrait that he had painted earlier. And in the original painting, it would have been reversed, because if an artist was copying a painting on an engraving, when it was printed, it would be a mirror image. So here is George Washington, victorious in battle, his right hand on the cannon, and as the caption says here, it is the first correct engraving of an American flag. And now we get into a comparison of a painting by Charles Willson Peale with Washington after the Battle of Princeton, a full-length portrait. And in his execution of this portrait, he is making George Washington in the same type of pose that you would have found for an official portrait of George Washington that we see here, of George III that we see here at right. So young George III on the right, and George Washington, our first true national hero, at left. This is a very interesting piece of linen. The original is at the Winterthur Museum in Pennsylvania, and it's the first image of George Washington printed on linen, a rare survivor of the time. We can see around the circle, we have cannons and flags, and it reads going around in the circle, George Washington Esquire. This is a Latinized word, foundator and protector of American liberty and independence. It's important for us to realize that George Washington, only in his 40s at this time, is already a national hero. And probably most people in the colonies would have had some image of him, thanks to the proliferation of things like this, whether they're on linen scarves or whether they are in prints. Here we have a wonderful broadside, a poster, a recruitment poster that says, "To all brave, healthy, able-bodied, and well-disposed young men in this neighborhood who have any inclination to join the troops now raising under General Washington for the defense of liberties and independence of the United States." So here we have various soldiers here, and this is a wonderful survivor from the time of the American Revolution of an actual Army recruitment poster. Two portraits of other well-known figures of the American Revolution. We have an engraving here of Sam Adams. Sam Adams, who was so important in the early days of the American Revolution. He was someone who spoke widely against British tyranny. And this engraving is based on a portrait made by John Singleton Copley. And if we were to look at the original portrait, it would be reversed. And I think at this point, early in the days of the Revolution, the people who are printing these images want the colonists to know and to be able to recognize some of the important people who are going to lead us to independence. At right, we have an image of John Hancock, not quite as elegant as his portrait by Copley, and we can see here that this is including the Declaration of Independence and his infamous signature. And this particular printmaker, John Norman, isn't as skilled an artist as some of our better known artists, but there is the image of John Hancock with the caption, "His Excellency John Hancock, Esquire, late President of the American Congress." One of the people that we certainly need to give credit to for giving voice to the American Revolution is Thomas Paine, who wrote the pamphlet Common Sense. There are many great sayings from this. "'Tis time to part. It is no time for the summer soldier or the sunshine patriot." And while the ideals of the Declaration of Independence may have been lofty for some people to perceive, this pamphlet, widely disseminated, was really giving logical reason for the colonists to revolt. So on the other side of the pond, in Britain, Thomas Paine would have been widely pilloried. So in this cartoon here, he is listed with all of his so-called faults, because in the eyes of established monarchy, these ideas of equality and so on are things that are disrupting the social order. So he is being really insulted with various things here, with cruelty, injustice, treachery, ingratitude, perjury, etc., etc. And sadly, Thomas Paine, widely known at the time of the American Revolution, eventually returned to England, died in poverty, and for years was in an unmarked grave. Another pretty wild cartoon here is one that is hoping that there would be a reconciliation between Britain and America. So we have Britain, the woman at right, looking a lot like Marie Antoinette, as I said earlier. And we have America as the Indian maiden with the feathers, and and she is holding a liberty cap on a stick, and she is saying, "Dear mother, please take me back." And then the British lady is saying, "Be a good girl and give me a bus or a kiss." So again, the cartoonists are having a field day with satirizing some of the elements of the two contrasting societies here. And as the war wound down, and we have the peace treaty, we have Benjamin West, whom you're going to hear more about again in our next series, attempting to paint the American commissioners for the peace negotiations with Great Britain in 1783. So you will recognize as the seated man with a slightly big tummy, that of course is John Adams, and we see Ben Franklin there. And why is it that the right-hand side of Benjamin West's canvas is left blank? And that's because the British members of the team refused to have their portraits included in this. So unfinished business. So as you can see here, with the images that we have seen, Americans would not have the visual vocabulary that we have grown up with that is so prevalent in textbooks, whether we think of the famous image of 1776 of the three men playing the fife and the drum, or images of Betsy Ross and Molly Pitcher and all of that. That would come later. But I feel that this was a worthwhile exploration of some of these early images that were widely disseminated during the American Revolution. So people, in addition to hearing the news, would have the images to accompany them. So what is coming up next? The painter who was most wrapped in the American Revolution as defining his chief artistic output would be John Trumbull. John Trumbull, a participant in the American Revolution, begins to paint scenes of the American Revolution during its time or right after. And John Trumbull gives us the iconic depiction of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He painted a variety of Revolutionary War battle scenes, and two of his paintings would be part of the panorama of American history that we find in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. So part two will be all about analyzing John Trumbull's paintings of the American Revolution. And then looking ahead to part three, we are going to look at everything that came after John Trumbull. And certainly there are wonderful images of the American Revolution that continued in the 19th and 20th century. So we'll really have to squeeze in as many as possible. And if you have an image, a visual image of the American Revolution, a famous painting that you remember from school, please contact me at my email below. It's a little bit easier to reach me than going through the television station. I certainly welcome feedback, and I look forward to continuing this exploration with you of the foundational years of our new republic. Thank you.